Well, thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm Ellen Nakashima. I'm a national security reporter here at the Washington Post. And I am joined by a stellar panel of cybersecurity experts and scholars who are going to discuss with us here today the most pressing threats to the United States posed by our top nation-state adversaries in cyberspace: China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. Starting from my left, we have Dmitry Alperovich, co-founder and chief technology officer of the cyber firm CrowdStrike, and an expert on cyber threats posed by all four adversaries. Next to Dmitry is Michelle Flournoy, former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy from 2009 to 2012, where she advised the Defense Secretary in national security and defense policy. And next to Michelle is Kareem Sajadpour, senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and known as the smartest man in Washington on Iran, and James Mulvenin, the Vice President of the Intelligence Division at Defense Group, Inc., and a specialist in the Chinese military and influence operations. During the discussion, if you have questions for our panelists, please be sure to tweet them to #PostLive. That's #PostLive. And I'm just going to dive in here because we don't have a lot of time. I wanted to start with you, James, and China. Last week, the president warned that China was seeking to meddle in the US elections. Do you see any evidence of that?
What Washington is confronting is something that they had not really paid a lot of attention to for a long time, which is that China has a global influence operations campaign of fairly large scale under its United Front work department. And it had gone largely unnoticed until people started picking away at it. But there's a key difference in the sense that they're more focused on making sure that there's a positive portrayal of China and to downplay criticism of China rather than, in the Russian case, to seek to disrupt our democratic processes and undermine the legitimacy of our system.
And real quickly for the audience, the United Front Work Department is?
So the United Front Work Department is a very large organization within the Chinese Communist Party that is dedicated to the propaganda and covert influence campaigns about the portrayal of China abroad to actually further China's national interests. And it has there are now a lot of reports in Australia and New Zealand about the activities of this organization, and now we are taking a very long look at it in the United States.
But are you seeing anything that looks to be in the way of interfering in or trying to influence either the political campaigns or meddling in infrastructure, anything related to the midterms?
Well, I think we're potentially going to find out some interesting things in Vice President Pence's speech tomorrow, where there's a promise that they're going to reveal some of the digging they've been doing on this. There is some discussion, for instance, about Chinese campaign finance issues at the local and state and Senate level. And I think we're going to need to dig deeper on that because I personally have not seen any concrete evidence of the same level of meddling, particularly directed towards the midterms.
Dmitry, or would you like to also weigh in? You've also studied China and cyber.
Yeah, so in 2015, the Obama administration struck an agreement with China to stop commercial espionage for the purposes of helping Chinese private and state-owned enterprises. Industries, and for a little bit afterwards, we actually saw a dramatic decline in Chinese intrusion activity. In the United States, there was still activity focused on the national security, sort of traditional espionage, but intrusions into private industry have dropped by over 90% based on our numbers. However, I can tell you that unfortunately now the Chinese are back. And we're seeing a huge pickup in activity over the course of the last year and a half. And nowadays, they are the most predominant threat actor that we're seeing breaking into institutions all over this country and Western Europe.
And are you seeing anything aimed at election infrastructure at all?
We're not seeing much on elections, but every sector of the economy is getting infiltrated, and IP has been stolen just like it was prior to the agreement.
Okay, and are we seeing any activity by China in social media, sort of taking a page from what Russia did in 2016?
No, I mean, it again is very oriented on creating a positive image. The Chinese government in particular has been really put on their back heels by the Trump administration trade policies. It has dramatically undermined the narrative that Xi Jinping had been pushing, that this was China's century, the China dream. They're still recoiling a bit from all of this external pressure and trying to figure out how best to respond. And their natural reaction is, let's mobilize our friends that we've built all of these relationships with over the years. And that has mainly been the focus of the information operations messaging.
Mm-hmm. So, Michelle, which is the bigger threat then to the United States today? Do you think, is it China or is it Russia?
I think they're both quite substantial but different in character.
Mm-hmm.
As has been described, China so far has been going primarily after both intelligence targets and also the theft of intellectual property that gives them economic advantage. Russia has been a bit more of a KGB type of approach, using the old Putin's old playbook, which is really cyber as part of a larger set of influence operations, trying to undermine democracy as an alternative to authoritarianism by getting inside our system and creating chaos and disruption and doubt. And so the social media campaign, the hacking of elections, all of this is really trying to undermine Americans' faith in democracy and to make America and our system look to the world very messy, very polarized, very dysfunctional, which only helps sort of Putin. In addition, he has traditional intelligence missions that he uses cyber for, such as collecting on military targets, trying to penetrate key parts of the critical infrastructure on which the military would rely to actually project power in a crisis, and so forth. So I would say they're both very substantial and they both need our attention, but they're somewhat different in their focus, at least right now.
What do you think, Dimitri?
Yeah, I agree with Michelle that they have different priorities, and certainly in the long term, probably in not just in cyber, but in geopolitics, China is a long-term threat. It's a much more powerful country. The military is growing in capabilities, particularly regionally, and we should be concerned about them in the long term. In the short term, certainly Russia can cause us a lot of trouble, and they're taking full advantage of that.
Right. So short term, Russia's probably a little more immediate, but in the long term, when we look at the strategic landscape, China is the greater threat. Okay.
I think so.
So Michelle, you pointed out that Russia carried off one of the most brazen information operations attacks on the U.S. In modern history in 2016. Both the Obama and Trump administrations imposed a series of measures to punish and deter Moscow. Have any of those measures had any real impact in changing Putin's behavior and changing Russia's behavior? Any ones that you've seen from both the Trump and the...
Yeah. Not so far. I think in order to really deter Putin, several things have to happen, and I don't think these have happened yet. A very clear declaratory policy that draws some lines and says, we will take certain types of attack as an attack on our vital interests, on our democracy, and you can expect substantial costs or consequences as a result. So we have to communicate kind of what we hold dear, and be clear that we will impose costs, not necessarily exclusively in the cyber domain, but using all the instruments of our national power. That's thing one. And then thing two is then we have to actually respond in ways that are effective, but not escalatory. And that is the real challenge. I do think this administration, at least in its documents, it's published a new national cyber strategy and a new defense strategy. And it does have some new concepts, like Defending Forward, which is authorizing the Defense Department, for example, to disrupt or defeat, halt cyber attacks at their source, which is a new posture. The Congress, in the recent Defense Authorization Act, gave the department the authorities, the legal authorities, to actually do that. What we don't know yet is like, how is that actually going to work in practice? What level of decision maker actually authorizes that, given the risk of blowback or retaliation or escalation? How do you get an integrated approach and a broad strategy across the whole of government, if this is just DoD acting alone? So there are a lot of unanswered questions. But at least in their documents and in the public statements from people like National Security Advisor Bolton, they intend to take a more aggressive posture to try to create some measure of deterrence.
Let me just ask you a question to get clarity on this. So until this strategy, the DoD didn't have the authority to halt, Cyber Command didn't have the authority to halt attacks at their source.
It was focused, previously it was focused on defending the .mil, the military's own networks, and then working with the private sector to improve their capacity to defend .com.
And now?
And now there is authorization anyway to both defend forward, which is to do offensive cyber that disrupts attacks at their source, and also asks DoD to be prepared to actually help defend key parts of critical infrastructure. Again, particularly those elements like the electrical grid and transportation that are most essential to being able to mobilize and use our military forces in a crisis.
Let me open this up to the full panel. Anyone can answer this. If you were the Secretary of Defense, or you, Michelle, or anyone else, under this new strategy and under a new executive order that gives the Secretary of Defense more latitude or authority to undertake offensive actions below the use of force against foreign adversaries, what measures would you direct Cyber Command to take to deter Russia right now in its aggressive, malign actions against the U.S.? Does anyone want to take a stab at that?
Well, I think first you need to frame it properly, and you need to say that we are in a deep deterrence hole right now with respect to both Russia and China. Over the last 20 years, there have been a series of escalating attacks by both actors that have undermined U.S. interests. And from the perspective of both Russia and China, they have not found our pain point yet. And we for a long time,
they keep looking.
They keep looking. They keep nudging. And for a long time, they looked at our declaratory policy, as Michelle mentioned, and the declaratory policy was, we will only respond if it results in the loss of human life. Well, there's a heck of a lot of terrible, damaging things you can do to U.S. national interests short of actually killing someone. And so that really didn't become a good operative definition for where our declaratory policy
doesn't our declaratory policy also include damage or destruction?
Yeah, well, it could include damage or destruction that is equivalent to, nuclear attack or something like that. But my bottom line is that when you're in a deterrence hole, the first thing you need to do is stop digging. And the second thing you need to do is recognize that a single action is not going to be sufficient to restore deterrent stability to that domain. That you have to have a consistent series of response actions, again, much more focused on deterrence through punishment than denial, because you can't deny the target set in cyber. It's just too much of it. It's connected to everything. So it has to be deterrence through punishment, and you have to be consistent. And my view is we're going to have to go through a series of balloon airlifts and Cuban Missile Crises before either Moscow or Beijing believes that we've actually returned ourselves to a level of deterrent stability.
Well, so Michelle talked about a declaratory policy. Does that mean we should have an explicit series of red lines, for instance, with respect to Russia? If you hack into voting systems or machines, we will then do X or take some sort of punishment, responsive action. How explicit should we be, and how, where should you draw the lines that would require a forceful response, be they sanctions or other actions?
My own view is that we should be very explicit, not necessarily, you have to think about what you want to do publicly versus what you want to convey very clearly and privately, but what kinds of attacks we consider beyond the normal sort of intelligence, reconnoitering that countries do to one another, and what we consider to be an actual attack, and how seriously we will take this. I don't think we want to be totally explicit about what exactly we would do in response. I think we want to suggest certain levels of consequence, but I think we need the freedom to tailor responses in a given situation. I also think it's worth thinking about what may work for deterrence with Putin in Russia may be different than what will work with China or with Iran or North Korea, because deterrence is about getting at what different leaders hold dear. And the answer to that question has to be tailored to the specific adversary.
So can we do a quick lightning round on what pain points you might press for Russia, Iran, North Korea, and China? You want to start with?
James?
Well, so as Dimitri mentioned, the executive order that actually called for cyber sanctions against senior Chinese state-owned enterprise officials if they materially benefited from Chinese state cyber espionage. There's a lot of lessons to be drawn there, which is, money talks. And those individuals, unlike the very low-level operators that the Justice Department had indicted a number of years earlier, those people were powerful. They were connected directly to the leadership in Beijing. And I would argue that that executive order and the threat of real sanctions, and not just because they wouldn't be able to go to Davos or pay their daughter's Harvard tuition out of their ill-gotten gains, but also because it just was a serious blow to very senior people who were really more Communist Party apparatchiks than commercial executives. Immediately got to the Chinese to the table, and Meng Jianzhu and other senior people came here and said, we're ready to negotiate. What do we need to do to deal with this? And I think the same would be true. I think we can walk it across in terms of actually hitting the financial pain points of central leaders who are often themselves kleptocrats and have amassed large fortunes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, the same economic sanctions on Russia haven't really, as you noted, changed their behavior. Right. So, and they're much more willing to accept a level of pain. So what would you do?
I think for Putin there are two key issues. One is his getting at his own legitimacy or perceptions of his legitimacy with his population. And we know that there's ample evidence that is known in the intelligence community about Putin's own corruption, and also a number of topics on which he clearly lies to his own people. So the whole question of outing Putin on some of these issues. And then I think the other thing is he's extremely reliant on the oligarchs around him for financial and political support. And again, creating some difficulties and pain for them to get them to lobby him to tone it down. I think those are the kinds of levers we need to explore more fully, in addition to things like sanctions and diplomatic repercussions.
What about you, Dimitri, on Russia? You've thought a lot about
Well, I do think that at some point we should be thinking about, if you can't beat them at this game, can you join them? And should we be engaged in our own information operations? Do some of the things that Michelle is talking about to make it clear that you can play this game. Let's be clear, when you look at the capabilities of our cyber command, they're head and shoulders above everyone else, including Russia. So can we unleash some of those capabilities of Cyber Command, NSA, and other intelligence agencies to actually do more in this space and actually have effects beyond just sort of the kinetic focus that they traditionally try to think about of, can we disable this node or take down this integrated air defense system, but can you actually do information operations?
What do you mean by that? Deception, disinformation, or?
All of the above, right? Potentially. We should be thinking about how do we use all toolkits of our power, including cyber, to achieve our effects.
I would add a slight footnote. I actually think what is most terrifying for Vladimir Putin is truth, is accurate information. Right. And rather than, thinking up a lot of deception measures, which is, has, I think, issues in terms of how our system works and our values and so forth, I think it's more about outing him and those around him about the truth of their ill-gotten gains, their actions, their corruption, their involvement in all kinds of illicit activities, and so forth. And so I would start by just sort of making the truth known and using that as an information operation, but before I'd go down the road that you're talking about. But
point taken.
Well, if you look at what they did in 2016, a lot of what they put out was actually truthful as well, right? So it doesn't have to be all deception.
Yeah. Kareem, what about Iran? To the extent that we want to make Iran behave or change its behavior in malicious actions in cyberspace, what do you think their pressure or pain points would be? And then also we can talk a little bit more about what you think they are doing now, or will they do now that the U.S. has pulled out of the Iran nuclear.
It's a good question. Just for broader context, Iran is a third-tier cyber power, with China, Russia, the United States being first-tier powers, European countries being second-tier powers. Iran is really a third-tier cyber power. But what we've learned is that third-tier cyber powers can have a huge impact on fifth-tier powers like Saudi Arabia. Iran's attack on Saudi Aramco was perhaps one of the costliest cyber attacks in history. And oftentimes, the most damaging cyber attacks don't necessarily need to be that sophisticated, like Russia's attack on the DNC proves. So Iran is a very motivated actor, and it can inflict a lot of damage. What Michelle just said about Russia, I think, also applies to Iran, in that I've always thought one of the best things that the US government can do in its Iran policy is simply reveal to the public, especially to the Iranian public, how much Iran is spending on Shiite militias, on Hezbollah, on Bashar Assad in Syria, Shia militias in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen, because this is at a time of enormous economic duress in Iran. Iranians, among the slogans people have been chanting when they take to the streets is "Forget about Syria, think about us." So I think to the extent you can just reveal, make public what Iran has been doing in the region, what it's been spending in the region, that would actually be very impactful.
And by the way, Ellen, having sat in some of the same policy and legal kinds of discussions internally that Michelle sat through, there's a tremendous blockage within the U.S. government system about telling lies abroad. Even though Congress has modified the laws that govern that to make it easier, we could actually rely on this, and we could say, well, our own system legally prevents us from telling a lot of untruths abroad, therefore everything we're saying has to be true. There will always be a percentage of the global population that thinks we're pathological liars, but for some people that will have a circular tightness to it that will be appealing.
Right. Well, Kareem, recently we saw Iran ran some large information operation on Facebook, and Facebook took down a number of Iranian accounts that seemed to be promoting Iran's policy goals. What do you make of that? Was Iran dipping its toe into the waters of social media manipulation? How does that fit into Iran's larger use of influence operations? Should we be worried about it at all or not?
So Iran operates in the cyber world the same way they do in the physical world, which is via proxy. They have their regional proxies. They like to try to maintain plausible deniability, and they like operations which are potentially very high impact and low cost, and cyber checks all of those boxes for them. They have plausible deniability. The folks who are their kind of cyber mercenaries aren't necessarily, they work perhaps under the umbrella of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, but in many cases they're private citizens who are not card-carrying believers of the Iranian revolution. And I think disinformation campaigns on Facebook, on social media, those are fairly cheap and potentially high impact. What we haven't seen is attacks on US infrastructure, things that people may have been anticipating in the aftermath of the Trump administration's pullout from the Iran deal. My sense is that at the moment, Iran is trying to project this notion that they are the responsible actor, and Trump's United States is the rogue actor. Iran has maintained its commitment to the nuclear deal. This is a temporary phase, I would argue. It's not going to be like this forever. Another kind of notable statistic about this was over the last 5-6 years, there were hundreds of incidents of Iranian harassment of US ships in the Persian Gulf. In the last year, it's almost come down to zero. They haven't really been testing missiles either. But I expect that as things begin to escalate in the coming year between the US and Iran, the cyber attacks will probably also increase.
What about North Korea, Dimitri, with denuclearization talks going on between Pyongyang and Washington? Do you think we'll similarly see a ratcheting down of its malicious activities against the U.S.?
Well, there are a couple of things that are very interesting about North Korea. One, I would actually argue that they're one of the most innovative cyber powers. So when you look at sort of history, they were one of the first nation states to actually use destructive attacks at scale back in 2009 against South Korean infrastructure, and then many other attacks that followed on wave after wave. And really, they've perfected the use of South Korea essentially as a testing ground for their cyber weapons and a free fire range, if you will. They also were one of the first ones to use influence operations against Sony. And I would argue that the US government at the time really underestimated the power of leaking of emails. They focused very much on the destruction of the network and not the fact that employees' data and emails were leaked out and terrorized the Sony employee base. And you could argue it's been a blueprint for some of the other doxing operations we've seen from other nation states afterwards. And of course, they engaged in traditional cybercrime operations, both breaking into banks and cryptocurrency exchanges in order to help fund their regime. So they're on the forefront of innovation in many of these areas, not necessarily technical capabilities, but in terms of how you use cyber to achieve national goals. But one of the more interesting things is that we actually have had deterrence, effective deterrence of North Korea so far in terms of targeting the US, with Sony being the one exception. They have not targeted the US. WannaCry was a kind of global attack that actually did not even have a much impact here in the United States, mostly in Europe and Russia, interestingly enough. But with regards to direct attacks on our infrastructure, even though they have the capabilities and they've demonstrated many times over in South Korea, they have not done it against us. It's an interesting question. I think that they have felt, at least until recently, that there was a possibility of kinetic retaliation against them, and they did not want to overtly attack the United States. In fact, even if you look at their activities in the last couple of decades in the kinetic space, yes, they've shelled South Korean islands, they've killed some South Koreans. They have never done that against the US military force there. So they're clearly afraid of us at the moment, at least. We'll see how things progress. But in terms of their activity now, what we're seeing is actually ramping up of intrusion activity related to traditional espionage. They're targeting the South Koreans, they're targeting policy people working on negotiations, just like any nation state would, in order to give them a better hand and try to understand what the other side is thinking. We're not seeing them at the moment engage in any destructive attacks, and we'll see how long it holds, but they're certainly on a charm offensive right now.
Karim, do you see any evidence that Iran and North Korea are working together on cyber attacks or cyber operations?
You know, I've often found in researching this stuff that those who know don't talk and those who talk don't know. So I suspect there is collaboration between Iran and North Korea and Russia, but they don't do these things in an open light, and so it's very difficult to prove. But I suspect they certainly have learned from one another and shared information with one another.
By contrast, one of the most prominent Iranian hackers who was doing research on attacking critical infrastructure was a guest scholar at Tsinghua University, China's MIT, for 2 years, learning about critical infrastructure and embedded control systems. That's not a level of state-to-state cooperation, but certainly was an interesting phenomenon to watch.
So, Dimitri, in general, how big a threat are Iran and North Korea? If we have of China and Russia at the top, and which one would you say is next?
Yeah, the way I would rank them is certainly you have Russia as the #1 cyber power out of those four from a technical capabilities perspective. China close behind. Then a little further down, North Korea, and then Iran. But Iran is trying to catch up very rapidly to the others, and North Korea, I would say, is also improving dramatically and is certainly trying to reach China's capabilities from a technical perspective.
Okay. Like half a minute we have left. I guess I wanted to just sort of ask any of the panelists here. The White House just announced a cyber strategy that you may have heard about or read about, and wondered whether you thought that would be an effective tool to counter these, top 4 malicious cyber actors, and if.
I think one of the most important things in that strategy was a declaratory policy that we will do attribution alongside with allies, and we will punish threat actors, and we will do so routinely. I think that's a very welcome change, where for the last 20, 30 years, the U.S. intelligence community have always often known who the threat actors were, but rarely talked about it publicly, and almost never engaged in actual punishment efforts against those threat actors. So that change in policy is very much welcome.
The parts of the strategy that I think are really important but don't get as much attention as deterrence and declaratory policy and operations are building international coalitions of like-minded states to share information, tools, approaches, to bolster deterrence as a coalition. Really developing our private sector partnerships, particularly private sector companies that operate and own most of our critical infrastructure. Those, we know it's important, but we haven't cracked the code on doing that well, in my view. And then finally, with cyber workforce development, we have a shortage of people in this country, both private sector and definitely in the public sector, who are really expert and can take these challenges on. We need to fundamentally think about how do we recruit those people, how do we develop them, how do we incentivize them to stay, how do we create a highway of people going back and forth between Silicon Valley, say, and the government, and really focus on the human capital dimensions, which aren't as flashy as some of the things we've been talking about here, but will be really essential to our success.
Well, thank you very much. That concludes our discussion this morning. I'd like to thank Dimitri and Michelle, Kareem, and James for being with us. And now my colleague Kat Zakruski will take the stage for the next segment. Thank you.